The iconic salmon often come to mind when people think about the U.S. Pacific Northwest. Although universally treasured, wild salmon are well on their way to fading from the region being Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Why? The current dire state of the Pacific Northwest salmon is not because society has been unwilling to spend money to save them. In fact, many billions have been spent on salmon recovery. A large, well-funded salmon recovery industry has long thrived in the region, and there appears to be no end in sight for this funding stream. Figure 1. Salmon may be the iconic species of the Pacific Northwest, but the abundance of all 5 species of wild salmon is only a sliver of their former magnitude. From a scientific perspective, the amount of research focused on salmon is greater than any other group of fishes in the world. In short, we know a lot about these animals, their environment, and what caused the long-term decline. This is not a "we need more science" policy challenge. The reality is, despite the massive sums spent on salmon science, Pacific Northwest wild salmon runs continue to decline over the long term, and a reversal seems unachievable unless there are politically contentious public policy changes. Wild salmon decline is indeed a natural resource policy conundrum. Everyone supports the recovery of these popular and iconic species, and a lot of money continues to flow to an army of scientists and other technical experts tasked with reversing the decline. But the downward trajectory continues. Nothing seems to change. Why? Outside the Pacific Northwest, there are flourishing wild salmon populations. Wild being individuals not raised in freshwater hatcheries or saltwater net pens. For example, many wild runs in Alaska and the Russian Far East are doing well. Conversely, farm salmon from Chile, Norway, British Columbia, and a few other locations provide abundant fresh salmon to retail markets year-round. Even in the Pacific Northwest, supplemental stocking from hundreds of inland fish hatcheries sustains runs substantially higher than wild-only runs, but still low by historical standards. These hatchery-enhanced runs are large enough to permit sustainable harvests, although at greatly reduced levels. Figure 2. Most salmon in the Pacific Northwest retail market are grown in net pens in Chile, Norway, Scotland, and British Columbia coastal environments, and are available fresh year-round. Net pen raised salmon will be available for the foreseeable future regardless of what happens to wild salmon in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So why is there such an apparent policy conundrum for Pacific Northwest wild salmon? After all, we have extensive scientific knowledge about the cause of the decline, and society continues to spend billions trying to help wild salmon. Perhaps even more incongruous, these are iconic species that everyone wants to save. Yet, almost all salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest remain a mere shadow of their pre-1850s levels. Further, most of these relatively small remaining runs are largely maintained by releases of hatchery-raised fish. Wild salmon, typically defined as those whose parents spawned naturally in natural habitat, comprise only a small portion of most current runs. Even including both hatchery and wild salmon, salmon runs are typically a single-digit percentage of the pre-1850s level. Scientists and others have documented all this for years. Yes, popular, expensive, and elaborate efforts to recover wild salmon runs continue unabated, especially in the most recent few decades, largely a response to the Endangered Species Act requirements. Although using hatcheries to sustain relatively large runs of salmon is plausible, albeit technically challenging, The dictates of the Endangered Species Act relative to wild salmon runs have made the continued role of hatcheries to supplement wild runs controversial. Many wild salmon advocates argue that supplemental stocking from hatcheries actually worsens the viability of wild salmon runs. Of course, without hatcheries, there would be essentially no salmon fishing in most of the Pacific Northwest, or California for that matter. In short, there is a low probability that current efforts collectively will substantially recover wild salmon to abundances that would assure self-sustainability and support substantial sport and commercial harvest. Even with large expenditures to recover wild salmon, why will wild runs likely continue declining over the long term? This brings us back to the policy conundrum. Figure 3. These days in the Pacific Northwest, most salmon harvested by commercial, recreational, and tribal fishermen respond artificially in hatcheries, such as this one, then raised through early life stages in that hatchery, eventually being released to migrate to the ocean. Recovery challenge. To succeed, any wild salmon recovery strategy must address several overarching and undisputed realities. Otherwise, it will be added to a long list, well over a century in the making, of noble, expensive, and failed salmon recovery strategies. Even as society continues to spend billions on restoring wild salmon runs, these efforts will only be marginally successful without a serious response to how much the Pacific Northwest has fundamentally changed and will change further through the rest of this century. What are these realities about the Pacific Northwest, and how must they be changed to have any chance of recovering wild salmon to something approaching historical levels? Reality 1. The first reality is that the baseline for any wild salmon recovery program begins with relatively few wild salmon. Wild salmon abundance in the Pacific Northwest is very low and has been so for a long time. Most spawning runs are far less than 10% of their pre-1850s levels. Over 24 Endangered Species Act, so-called species, meaning distinct population segments, are now listed as threatened or endangered. Many runs have already disappeared, and more will likely follow unless the overall long-term trajectory reverses. Figure 4. The 1848 discovery of gold in California typically signifies the beginning of the salmon decline in the western United States. Additional findings of gold and other minerals in many locations in the Pacific Northwest, concurrent with many other human activities, resulted in a more prominent region-wide footprint and reduced the amount and quality of freshwater habitat available to salmon. Reality 2. Similar to the first reality, we've been well aware for a long time of the main causes of the dire state of salmon runs along the West Coast. These causes are well documented scientifically and include mining, dams for many purposes, water pollution, habitat alteration, overfishing, irrigation and other water withdrawals, predation on salmon by many species, interaction and competition with hatchery-produced salmon and other often non-native fish species, short and long-term changes in climate and ocean conditions, and many other causes. Reality 3. Broadly speaking, where wild salmon runs were once plentiful, Europe, Asian Far East, Eastern North America, the decline in their abundance is roughly inversely proportional to the area's growth in the human population and the associated infrastructure. Over decades and centuries, as the human population expanded in these regions, the size of the salmon runs predictably, in the long term, declined to low levels. For example, from a pre-1850 human population level of a few 100,000, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho are now home to roughly 14 million people. Over the same period, the wild salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest have declined from roughly 40 to 50 million to a few million. Figure 5. The human footprint in the Pacific Northwest has steadily increased since 1850. From a salmon perspective, imagine how different this landscape was pre-1850. By 2100, mostly driven by the inflow of people to this region, the human population will likely be several times greater than it is today. And the future for human population growth in the Pacific Northwest? Assuming the most likely human population growth rate, by 2100, there will be somewhere between 35 and 45 million people, a middle-of-the-road forecast for the end of this century, less than 80 years from now. Based on past experience elsewhere, the consequences for Pacific Northwest wild salmon are predictable. Reality 4. Without dramatic changes in politically popular public policies and lifestyle choices, options for restoring salmon runs to significant sustainable levels are greatly constrained. It is not just the sheer number of humans in the Pacific Northwest, but their individual and collective lifestyle that reduces the abundance of wild salmon. For example, by 2100, with 35 to 45 million people living in this region, considering the additional demands for houses, roads, grocery stores, coffee shops, electricity for air conditioning and heating, athletic facilities, parking, domestic, industrial, and agricultural water, office buildings, ski resorts, schools. The list is a very long one. Unabated, this increasing footprint will accelerate the downward pressure on the remaining wild salmon runs. Given these 4 realities, what are the prospects for current Pacific Northwest wild salmon recovery efforts to change the long-term downward trajectory for wild salmon? The simple answer, poor, and getting worse. Indeed, the political and practical trade-offs necessary to achieve salmon recovery will not get easier as we move through this century. The policy conundrum. To restore wild salmon runs to significant sustainable levels, a wild salmon recovery strategy must change all 4 realities. If society continues to spend billions of dollars on what is politically popular and fails to address the realities, efforts to restore wild salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest will be inadequate. And with near certainty, the long-term downward trajectory of wild salmon will continue. Thus, the policy conundrum remains. Even though wild salmon recovery enjoys popular support at the abstract level, it appears that society is collectively unwilling to make the difficult, expensive, and politically unpopular decisions needed to reverse the decline in any meaningful way. Figure 6. Here are several large and expensive fish ladders installed to help migrating salmon swim past major dams. Billions have been spent reversing the decline of wild salmon in the Pacific Northwest, but reversing the factors that actually caused the massive decrease would require immense human behavioral and lifestyle change. And there is no indication that most people are willing to make those changes. Society does have alternative policy options. For example, it would be relatively easy to maintain thriving, sustainable populations of many non-native fish species, namely American shad, smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, walleye, bluegill, brook trout, northern pike, channel catfish, and striped bass. These species, unlike salmon, are well adapted to the greatly altered Pacific Northwest aquatic environment. With the drastically changed aquatic environment, it is not surprising that such non-native fish species thrive. Conversely, it is also not surprising that wild salmon are struggling to hang on in Pacific Northwest environments for which they are now poorly adapted. The conundrum remains. If the four realities do not change, no one should be surprised by the lack of long-term success of wild salmon recovery efforts. Perhaps politically, these billions of dollars spent to recover wild salmon should be considered guilt money, modern-day indulgences, a tax that society and individuals willingly endure to alleviate collective and individual remorse about the sorry state of wild salmon. It is money spent on activities unlikely to achieve the recovery of wild salmon, but it helps many people feel better as they continue the behaviors and choices that preclude wild salmon recovery. This presentation was an audio version of an article published in Water Resources Impact, the professional magazine of the American Water Resources Association. Here is a link to the published paper, which includes all literature citations and supporting material.